Hi everyone. Today in this video, we are going to be talking about internal lines. Internal lines are basically lines inside of our pattern that appear like red lines inside of our 2D pattern here that we can basically edit. So they're markings on our pattern that we can apply different editing to, for example, elastic, top stitching, sewing, different things like that too. Because we can't just add those details here in the middle of our pattern in this open space. We can only add those things to edges of our pattern or internal lines. So that's why you'll want to know how to make internal lines and how to add them. So we're starting out with this basic dress pattern right here. And we're going to go into our 2D toolbar on the right side here. And we're going to go to the internal line tool, which looks like this rectangle with a solid white line and a semicircle shape out of it in the middle. You want to make sure you're clicking on the one with the solid line, not the dotted line below it. The dotted line below is baselines, but we're going to be using internal lines for this video. So I'm going to click on that. And that gives us our polygon internal line tool. This basically works the same way as our polygon pattern creation tool, but this will be drawing internal lines. So I'm going to zoom in to our front dress pattern, and I'm just going to draw a shape in here just to practice and show you how it works. Like I said, it works very similar to our our polygon pattern creation tool, where I can click, continue clicking, and it's drawing a shape. And I can always click on the point that I started on to close my shape, and that will draw a shape right there. So I'm going to click delete, because we also have the option with internal polygon/line to not create a closed shape. I can also just create a line. And so to finish my line, I can always just click again on that last point that I started, and that would give me just a single line instead of a closed shape. So I'm going to delete that, and then I'm going to delete this other shape too, and then go back to my internal line tool. And then with the same way that our polygon pattern creation tool works, I can create curved lines by clicking and dragging. And if I wanted to get rid of a curved line after a curve, I would just click again on that last point, and that would get rid of the curved anchor. So I could do a curved line and then a corner and double click or close my shape to finish. And that closes and completes my internal line. And so this is basically just like some markings on our pattern that we can apply editing to. So I'm just going to first show you how we can draw these lines, and then later show you how we can add the editing to them. But a couple of other types of internal lines that we have are our internal rectangle also. This works the same as our rectangle pattern creation tool. I can click and drag and hold down shift to get a square, or just left click and get a pop-up box here to be able to type in my dimensions. But I'm going to delete those. And then if I hold the internal line tool down again, I can also get to internal ellipse, where I can click and drag and hold down shift, or just left click and get my pop-up menu to type in my dimensions. And one thing with internal lines is you might have noticed I was deleting them by going to our transform pattern tool and holding down shift to select all of them in our garment. But one thing we can also do is in our edit pattern tool, we can, when I click, it selects just one segment of the internal line. But if I were to double click, it would select the whole shape. And then if I double click again, it will select all of the internal lines inside of my pattern shape. So that's one way you can select internal lines within a pattern shape. But then if I go back into my internal line tool, the last one I have here is the dart. And this is one way that we can create darts in our pattern using internal lines basically to cut our pattern. And how this works is I can do the same things, like I can click and drag. And you'll see, because I'm in the dart tool, it automatically cut that piece out right here, and it applied sewing. So if I were to simulate, you can see that dart is sewn and finished there. Another way that we can use the dart tool is we can also just left click, and that will give us dimensions that we can type in for what we want our dart to be like. So any type of shape that you want your dart to be, you could type that in, click OK, and it would automatically create that. So if you have certain dimensions or if you just want to draw it, you can do that. And we can go in and delete those darts the same way that I deleted the other internal lines. So creating darts as internal lines, that's the only type of internal line that's going to automatically add sewing or cut the fabric. But that can be a helpful tool also. And if you are using that tool, it might also be helpful to add some other markings on your pattern to let yourself know where you want to add that dart. For example, if you wanted to have the dart directly below the shoulder seam, I could always go into my internal polygon/line tool, click on my shoulder seam, and maybe use a curved line to draw this line right here where I wanted my dart to be, and then go back into my dart tool, and then that would allow me to place it directly on top of that line. Even if I get a little bit off, I can always go in and click on this and drag it. And so now I have it placed directly on top of that internal line. And so you can use internal lines to work together also. I'm going to delete both of those and turn on simulation mode to reset again. And then show you a couple more things that we can do with internal lines. So I'm going to go back into the internal line/polygon tool, and I'm just going to draw some lines here on my pattern that I might want. So I'm just going to do like a style line right there. And then also on the back, I'm going to do like a waist line, and then just this one right here. And this pattern isn't symmetric, so I'm just going to go to my internal line and actually just do a different type of style line here on the other side. So now we've got a couple of different internal lines on our pattern. And some things that we can do with it. I am in our edit pattern tool right here. I'm just going to double click on this internal line to select the whole thing. I can always right click on the pattern, and here in the middle of my right click menu, I have a cut and a cut and sew option. If I were to cut, it would just separate the pattern at those points. So it would give me 2 pattern pieces right here. And so those would not be sewn together. So if I simulated, they would just kind of fall apart. If I wanted to have them sewn together, I could. But if I didn't want it to be sewn together, this would work also. So I'm going to click Command Z to just go back to before those were cut. And then I'm going to select that internal line again. And this time I'm going to choose the cut and sew. And this does the same thing. It cuts the pattern, but it actually also sews it together. So you can see when I pull it apart here in the 3D window, the seam lines are there. So that sewing has been applied. So if I were to turn on simulation mode, now I have a seam right here. And this is helpful because you might sometimes have seams that you want for like visual purposes or functional purposes, but this can be a helpful way to apply a seam onto like a basic pattern or silhouette that you want. And then we can also go in and apply different types of fabric or colors or prints to both of these pattern pieces too, now that they're separate patterns. With our internal lines, we can also continue to edit them the same way we could edit a pattern outline. So I can always go in and click on a point from my internal line and edit that, or click on a point and adjust the curve line, or use any of the other pattern editing tools that I have. So if I were to double click on this internal line again, also I can cut and sew this one. And now I have both of those seams on those sides. And then I'm going to also jump to the back to the internal lines that I added here, and then show you some other things that we can do to internal lines also. And so we can't see the internal lines here on the back yet because I haven't cut them or sewn them, so they're just basically markings on our 2D pattern. But if you did want to see them on your 3D window also, we could go over to our garment display icon menu on top of the 3D window, and I could turn on show internal lines, and that would have let them appear here. That way, if I didn't like the placement in the 3D window, I could always go and edit it here in the 2D window also. But one thing that we can also do to our internal lines is we can add top stitching, we can also add elastic, we can add puckering, and other details like that to our internal lines. And we can only do that to internal lines or pattern edges. So if you don't want one of those details on a pattern edge, then you'll want to create an internal line for it. And I show you how to apply elastic in another separate video, but just know that you can do that on an internal line too. But I'm going to open up the object browser and property editor here on the right. And we have our top stitching tab right here, and then also our puckering tab. And so if I wanted to apply either of those to my garment, for example, to some of these internal lines, if I go into the top stitching tab, it automatically brings me into my edit top stitching tool. But I can always go to segment top stitching and select any segment or internal line that I want to add top stitching to. And if I zoom in, you can slightly see that top stitching there next to my internal line. I'm just going to go into my default top stitching and change the color so you can see it a little bit better. But we go over a lot more details about top stitching in another video and how to edit them. And so that is somewhere you can also go to find out more information, but just so you know, you can apply top stitching to internal lines. Same thing with puckering. If I go to my puckering tab, it automatically puts me in the edit puckering tool, but I want to switch into our segment puckering. And you'll see when I go to any segment on my pattern, it does allow me to highlight pattern edges and internal lines. So I could apply puckering to either of these. And you can kind of see that apply here in the 3D window also. If I were to go back to the front of my garment, even though these aren't internal lines anymore, I could always add puckering or top stitching to these too because they are now pattern edges. And so we also talk about editing puckering in a different video too, more in depth, but just so you know, you can apply it here to internal lines. With internal lines, you can always adjust them also. So for example, if I had an internal line right here, and maybe I meant for it to go all the way to the edge of this pattern, I can also go in and edit it the same way that I began to edit the other internal lines by right-clicking on it. And I can choose either extend/trim or extend/trim and add point. If I were to extend/trim, I can choose to pattern outline or to internal line if there was one there. And that would extend it to the pattern edge or trim it if I had made it longer. And then this one is the same, but it would add a point to the outside of the pattern. I don't want to add any unnecessary points, so unless I need a point for a specific reason, I'm just going to do extend/trim to pattern outline, and now that internal line goes all the way across, which can be helpful if I did want to cut this seam or add a detail across this line all the way across the pattern and not just with that little bit missing at the end. So those are the basics of internal lines, but I'm going to also link you to the video that you can watch about more details about puckering and top stitching, which we talked about a little bit in this video, which are also related to internal lines.